24-year-old Nagaenthran from Perak is said to have an IQ of 69, which is a level recognized as a disability. He has been on death row in Singapore since 2010 for smuggling 42.7 grams of heroin into the city-state a year earlier. Meanwhile, Nagaenthran's family lawyer and Surendran said Nagaenthran should not be hanged under Singapore's law and also international law.
Nagaenthran Damalingam, the Malaysian man found guilty of drug trafficking in Singapore, has been executed, says his family. His brother Navin Kumar told Reuters by telephone on Wednesday morning that the execution had been carried out and his remains will be brought back to Ipoh for the funeral. The 34-year-old had been on death row for more than 1 decade for trafficking 43 grams of heroin into Singapore in 2009. His lawyers filed multiple appeals against his execution, saying he was intellectually disabled. On Tuesday, a Singapore court dismissed a last-ditch challenge filed by his mother to set aside her son's conviction and death sentence. The court said Nagaenthran had been given due process in accordance with the law. At the end of the hearing, Nagaenthran and his family reached through a gap in a glass screen to grasp each other's hands tightly as they wept. His cries of "Ma" could be heard around the courtroom. On Twitter,
Malaysian activists and leaders gathered in front of the Singapore High Commission on Saturday in a wave of support to pardon Nagaenthran Damalingam, who is on due to be hanged in Singapore next week for drug trafficking.
Nagin's mother, Madam Panchalai, had to stand up in court and address the judges herself because the family did not have a lawyer to represent them. And unfortunately, her application was dismissed by the court, and therefore the execution was going to go forward. So all the family had in the end was an opportunity to hold hands with him in court, which was a big deal because in Singapore, when you visit a death row prisoner, there's no contact, there's no way to touch. And so being in court, being able to put his hand through the slit in the glass pane of the dock was the only time he could touch his mother in so many years. So the family had that for a little while and a 2-hour visit in the holding area in the basement of the courthouse, and then they had to say goodbye. And this morning, I believe around dawn, he was hanged. So his brother had to go and identify and claim his body from the prison this morning. And there was a short wait in Singapore, and now he's finally on his way back to Ipoh, Malaysia, where his family live.
Yeah. You know, Singapore has very strict trafficking rules and they make that very, very clear. You know, during the course of his trial, was it clear that because of his disabilities, his intellectual disabilities, that he understood these rules when he entered the country with this quite small amount of drugs?
So the Singapore state's position is that he did understand and he knew what he was doing, but there was accounts from experts who said that, you know, his borderline intellectual functioning, his ADHD and other cognitive impairments could have influenced the way he made decisions. You know, even if he might kind of, you know, as the state says, know what is happening, the way he reasons, the way he understands consequences and makes choices is very different from what we might expect, you know, if we kind of substitute ourselves. That's not how we should think about it. You know, in the same way that children might know right from wrong, but then they make impulsive decisions because the way they understand consequences, the way they think about, you know, how to make decisions and how to make choices is very different.
And has that ever been an argument that has won through in Singapore cases against drug traffickers?
It's quite difficult, I think, because in Singapore, under the law, you don't just have to prove that you had abnormality of mind, so that's the legal term. But that alone is not enough. You have to prove that you had an abnormality of mind that affected your mental responsibility for the act of drug trafficking, and that's a higher bar. And we have, you know, cases where state psychiatrists and independent psychiatrists will completely disagree on whether someone had the mental responsibility for the act or not. So it can be quite difficult.
Singapore seems to be very committed to executing death row inmates when so many other developed countries are phasing out this practice. Is there any evidence that it is a deterrent?
The government claims so, but there isn't actually any evidence that it deters drug trafficking, particularly because the vast majority of death row prisoners in Singapore are on death row for drug trafficking, just like Nagin, and just like the Chinnamuthi, who is also scheduled to be executed on Friday. But there's no evidence that these executions will actually deter or fix the problem of drug trafficking or drug addiction. And it's just a narrative that the government has been repeating for many, many years, when there's mounting evidence around the world that this sort of approach doesn't actually work.
You know, as an anti-death penalty activist, is there any sense that there is any progress being made in trying to change Singapore's mind?
So there's not a lot of indication of progress on the side of the government, but among Singaporeans, particularly the younger generation of Singaporeans, there has been a growing skepticism of these government claims that the death penalty works. There has been a growing willingness to challenge the death penalty as a system, and to pay attention to the fact that it disproportionately affects ethnic minorities and marginalized communities and vulnerable people like Nagin. And so we saw recently, in this month, we had 2 anti-death penalty protests that brought about 400 people each, which is a very significant number for Singapore, actually. And so it does feel to me, as someone who's been working on this issue for over a decade, that the ground is shifting. Then people are more willing to question and to challenge and to call for abolition of the death penalty.
You spent time with the family today. How difficult a task was that, Kirsten?
It's really difficult for families to accept an execution, because it just doesn't make sense in anybody's mind, actually, that yesterday in court we saw Nagin, and he was young and healthy and able to smile at us and wave at us and gesture to his brother asking, like, have you eaten, and today he's dead. It just doesn't make sense, and it's especially difficult for families to accept. So a lot of Nagin's family had gone back to Malaysia already, so his younger brother had to collect the body alone today, and that was very difficult. I was talking to him and he just kept saying, I don't know how to describe how I feel. It's really, really tough for them to have to accept that he's...
Nagaenthran mempunyai
and it's painful for all of them, because they understand this trauma that Nagin's family is experiencing right now.
Kurang. Bila IQ dia kurang, according to international law, sesiapa yang ada IQ yang kurang, hukuman gantung tidak boleh dibagi.
Nagaenthran mempunyai mental disability ataupun kekurangupayaan mental disability, dan di bawah undang-undang Singapura, undang-undang antarabangsa, beliau tidak boleh digantung. Itu adalah satu kesalahan dari segi international law. Tetapi walaupun banyak rayuan telah dibuat, termasuk daripada Perdana Menteri Malaysia, yang di Pertuan Agong dan seluruh komuniti antarabangsa, kita amat kesal bahawa pihak Singapura telah pun menetapkan tarikh penghukuman penggantungan pada 27 April 2020, iaitu hanya beberapa hari lagi, hari Rabu.
He said the Malaysian government still has enough time to take a firm action on this incident towards the International Court of Justice.
Kita lihat pada hari ini ramai rakyat Malaysia dari NGO, parti politik, MGO dan sebagainya hadir pada hari ini, dan ini menunjukkan perasaan rakyat Malaysia. Jadi saya minta supaya kerajaan Malaysia, Perdana Menteri dan sebagainya, kabinet mengambil tindakan apa-apa lagi yang boleh dibuat untuk hentikan pembunuhan kejam terhadap Nagin.
Also standing in solidarity are Lawyers for Liberty, Anti-Death Penalty Malaysia Network, and over 200 Malaysians.
We're declaring this tonight. Spring